that brings us to our final presentation of the day, and it is from my friend and mentor, Dr. Jason Karlawish. Dr. Karlawish is Professor of Medicine, Medical Ethics, and Health Policy, as well as Neurology at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. He's a director of the Outreach Recruitment and Education Corps in their Alzheimer's Disease Center. He's also the co-director and attending physician for the Penn Memory Center. He's chaired the Ethics Committee of the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study for many years and has now taken on the reins of the Ethics Committee for the Alzheimer's Disease Clinical Trial Consortium. He's the author of a fantastic book, Open Wound, The Tragic Obsession of Dr. William Beaumont, which I highly recommend. And he's one of the more eloquent presenters in our field. And I've asked him to come and give us a lecture about the future of clinical practice for Alzheimer's disease and the role of clinical trials in developing that future practice. Thank you, Dr. Karlawish.
All right. Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be here in Irvine. Can I close this laptop?
Yes.
Okay. And whoever's running the lights, I don't have slides, so why don't you dial the lights up so those here in the afternoon wake up a bit. And the two spotlights on me, if they're really needed, fine, but otherwise you can dial those down. So, sorry, all those requests. Leave it to the guy from Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to be here in Southern California. It's nice to see a climate that doesn't rain. That's all we've seen for the last several weeks on the East Coast. I want to thank Frank LaFurla and Jim McClear for organizing this, but I especially want to thank Josh Grill. So I've known Josh for 10, 11 years now. I knew Josh when he was a staff member at the UCLA Medical Center. And look how far you've come, Josh. You're associate professor and helping run the Mind Institute, a leader in the Alzheimer's Center here, and a leader in the field. Josh does outstanding research at the intersections of clinical trials, ethics, and clinical trial design. And so I think this conference, Josh, and the number of folks here and whatnot is a testament to how well you've come. So I'm no longer your mentor, though. I'm your colleague. It's wonderful to be able to say that as a former mentor. Josh asked me to speak about redefining Alzheimer's disease, the role of clinical trials. That's a title I want to slightly rephrase into redefining Alzheimer's disease, the role of drugs and biomarkers. And what I'm going to do is tell you a story about how Alzheimer's disease is part of a larger story that's occurring in medicine about a change in the way we define what's a disease, therefore who's a patient, how many people have the problem, and back to patients, what's the experience of having that newly redefined disease defined on the basis of drugs and biomarkers. So once upon a time, the concept of disease was grounded in stories. Stories told by a patient, someone who was suffering, and interpreted by a physician. So the standard beginning of the medical encounter was the elicitation of the chief complaint. What's the problem? Why are you here? How can I help you? Said the physician. And then the patient would reply with a story of illness, what was called a history of present illness. And then out of that history would be guided a physical, perhaps some tests, biopsies, etc. And then what would be performed is the act of clinical pathologic correlation. The story that the patient told, the clinical story, the history, matched to pathology that was found either by exam or tissue samples, would be matched together to say the disease that explains your suffering is pneumonia, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease. So medicine, through physicians, was the arbiter of what is a disease and therefore who's a patient. And so, for example, who gets to adopt the sick role? By the sick role, I mean once labeled as a patient that the problems you're having, the things you're complaining of are the result of a disease, you get to adopt the sick role. You get to say, I'm a patient, therefore I get time off from work. I get time off from home obligations. Society owes me certain things. Care, more or less, depending on the country you live in, is given to you. And if you're not a patient, those things aren't given to you. That's absenteeism at work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Concepts of disability follow, et cetera. The physician was also the arbiter of the size and the scope of the problem of a disease. And in other words, the prevalence, in the words of an epidemiologist. How big is the problem? How many people have the disease? Now, though, I would argue that new technologies, in particular drugs and biomarkers, are defining diseases. The physician is an intermediary. They're using these technologies and the drugs, but they are not the arbiter. It is those technologies that have the power to say what is and what's not a disease, who has it. And so now what we have is a world where physicians, together with the owners of the drugs and biomarkers, the corporate scientists, the executives in the corporate suites, are those who decide what's the disease, who has it, how big is the problem. I'll explain how this came to be, how it's changing the concept of the disease we all care about, and going to change the patient experience of that disease. And I'll close by really honing in particular on the consequences of this that it will present for living with Alzheimer's disease in the future. Now, I've used this word technology, and what I mean by that simply is are tools that aren't just tools, but they have this very practical purpose of helping us learn what something is and doing something. And the interesting thing about technologies is they don't just do something, they don't just put the screw in the wood, but in using technologies, you learn something about the wood. And in learning something about the wood that you put the screw in, you actually start to change the way you understand that wood and what it is, etc. There's a sort of looping effect that goes on. Okay, I realize I'm losing you. This is getting a little into like history, sociology of science. This is what you came for. So let me give you some concrete examples. Jason Karlawish, intern at Francis Scott Key Medical Center, Department of Medicine, shows up for his precepted outpatient medical clinic during my internship. And I see one of my first patients. He's a 70-some-odd-year-old guy, some shortness of breath from COPD, etc. And on his vitals, and I present him to my attending, Dr. Michael Fingerhood. And I present the history and the exam. And on the exam, I note that he has a blood pressure of 170/80, along with the other findings. And I'll never forget, Dr. Fingerhood, in the true Socratic tradition of medical training, says, well, what do you want to do about that blood pressure, 170/80? And I said, nothing. And he said, that's right. Why is that? And I said, because that is the compensatory response of the aging vascular system to the need to maintain blood flow into the brain and elsewhere, and to lower that would only be harmful. And that is what we do. And he said, that's exactly right. Fast forward just 1 year, and the systolic hypertension in elderly persons, otherwise known as the Shep Trial, is released. And Shep shows that if you take men just like that man and give them either thiazide or a beta blocker, or compared to placebo, that those who get the thiazide or beta blocker have less heart failure and death from cardiovascular disease than those who don't. And so what was, for that up until then, age-related change in blood pressure became systolic hypertension in elderly persons, a diagnosed and treatable disease. And so by the time I was a fellow in geriatric medicine at the University of Chicago, 95% of my clinic was on an antihypertensive because a lot of them had blood pressures that were elevated. Overnight, what was seen as an age-related change in blood pressure became seen as a diagnosis of systolic hypertension in elderly persons, and the rest is, if you will, history. Once upon a time, the fracturing of vertebra, particularly in a woman, particularly in a white woman, was considered certainly a disease, if you will. It's a vertebral fracture from osteoporosis. But what the field struggled with, medicine, was what measure can you make to say before there's a fracture that this person has osteoporosis? It's obvious once there's a fracture, a painful back, and it's disabling, or even worse, a broken hip. But prior to that, what we would find is that every measure of bone mineral density we would get really couldn't predict who would and wouldn't get a fracture, until finally a large population cohort study out of the Mayo Clinic said that if you compare across a population of aging women their bone mineral density to 30-year-old women, because we have all this population data that they got, you could actually renorm bone mineral density in older women to describe accurately their risk of a fracture. And then the next step was the development of drugs that would alter the decline in bone mineral density, the bisphosphonates, and therefore reduce the risk of developing a fracture if you fell and break your hip. And so was discovered the disease of osteoporosis, what had once been felt to be sort of age-related changes in bone mineral density, really only diagnosed once there's a fracture, became something that was diagnosed in someone who walked in feeling fine, but then got their DEXA scan and got a calculated risk of developing a fracture, and based on that risk, gets a bisphosphonate. And for any white woman here over the age of 60 or so who's seen medical care, you know what I'm talking about. And finally, there's cardiovascular disease. Once upon a time, cardiovascular disease was exertional angina or persistent substernal chest pain with other signs consistent with a heart attack, and that would define someone who had heart disease, cardiovascular disease. And yet the field knew there must be things going on prior to the exertional chest pain, prior to the heart attack, that are leading up to this. But what are they? Well, the bottom line was we looked to a group of adults who had an unusual rare disease caused by a gene mutation that caused them to have very high levels of cholesterol. People who by the age of 30, certainly by 40, would have heart attacks and often be dead. And we did an experiment on them. And the experiment was we gave them a drug called Mevacor or placebo, and over time showed that those who got the drug compared to placebo lowered their cholesterol levels and were less likely to have a heart attack, sudden death arrest, etc. It was a rare genetic disorder. We're talking about just a few 100,000 people at most. But, of course, generalize that out to the wider population of individuals who might not have as high levels of cholesterol, but certainly have high cholesterol. And the rest is the story of the birth of Lipitor. Mevacor became Lipitor, and the rest is the cholesterol story. So again, what was a disease defined by signs and symptoms, a history of present illness, exertional chest pain, etc., became an asymptomatic disease diagnosed not by signs, symptoms, but by a blood test, a cholesterol test. So let's review what we have there with those three examples. Asymptomatic elevation of blood pressure now becomes a disease, treated based on the test, and then you get a drug. Reduction in the bone mineral density, no fracture, no pain complaints, no fracture seen on exam, but that test shows reduction in bone mineral density, and so follows the drug. Elevated LDL level, or whichever ratio now is hot in measuring this, that defines the disease and therefore the drug. So the common features of what I'm trying to tell you about all these age-related diseases is this intimate link between a test, bone mineral density, blood pressure, cholesterol measure, and a drug, which together have defined the disease state because an experiment prior showed test, give drug, change future clinical outcome. And that's the model of disease I'm speaking of, and I'm going to now pivot in a bit to talking about that model applied to Alzheimer's disease. What I'm talking about is the transformation of disease going from the bedside of the sick patient, the person coming in, if you will, with the chief complaint, to, if you will, almost the desktop of a clinician with a fast network computer having gathered data about you that then says this is what your risk is and what we need to do to reduce that risk. And I give that example, that metaphor of desktop medicine, to emphasize the technologies that made this possible. It's not just the tests that I've mentioned, blood pressure, bone mineral density, cholesterol. It's not just the drugs, but it's the ability to assemble vast networked databases to be able to describe who's at risk. Network databases that weren't possible until the last 20, 30 years. I have friends who are a bit older than me who remember in college running very complex computer software algorithms. And they would do them in the evening because you would hit the return key, lock the door to your office, and come back in the morning, and the output occurred at about 3 a.m. because it took the computer that long to do the analyses. The early founders of the Framingham study used punch cards and would take about a month to do analyses now that can be done again in the strike of a key. And you cannot underestimate the importance of those technologies and the transformations that I'm talking about. So, I hope I've given you some vivid case examples, most of which I think there's not a person in this room who doesn't have a personal experience either as patient or family member of the patient. I've given you those examples to now think about the disease we all care about, Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease still remains a bedside diagnosis. Every Monday at 8 a.m., 8:30 a.m. at the Penn Memory Center, we have consensus conference where we review the diagnostic follow-ups that are coming in that week. And it still is just like I trained. A vivid history, exam, testing, imaging, for then a discussion of what we think the diagnosis is. It's no different than what I witnessed when I was a first-year medical student. And what we're relying on is making that clinical label of dementia to then decide what's the disease that's causing it. How little has changed since the days of Dr. Alois Alzheimer's when he met Auguste Dieter at the Frankfurt Asylum. Actually, his name is actually Klaus Dieter. Her husband brings her in because he can't take care of her anymore, and the rest follows with this history, this exam, and then she's followed and followed for a few years until she dies. He gets her brain, and he opens it up, and he looks, and he sees the unusual substance along with, between the neurons, what we now know as the amyloid plaques, and within the dead neurons, these tangles of where only a ghost of a neuron was, which we now think of as tangles of tau protein. Things aren't much different since that, actually, although they're changing, and I'll talk about that. A couple points about this disease, Alzheimer's disease. It was not Alois Alzheimer's who named it after himself. It was actually his mentor, a psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin, who gave it the name Alzheimer's disease. It was a brief section in Kraepelin's textbook of psychiatry where he gave it the name Alzheimer's disease. And in language that isn't so clear, said it's this distinct disease. It's not the thing we're seeing in older adults, which senile dementia. It's not vascular dementia either. He's wanted to make those points. And that moment then in that textbook is often viewed as why from about 1920 forward, the vast majority of older adults who had dementia had senile dementia, and Alzheimer's disease was a rare and uncommon cause of dementia seen in individuals who were younger, under 60 or so. And that's what I was taught, for example, in medical school. I remember distinctly that was the distinction we drew. There was senility, and then there was Alzheimer's disease, a rare cause. And the general take was, well, that's what had been in Emil Kraepelin's text, and that's just the way the field settled on that for about a half a century. But of course, it's presumptuous to think that that's the case. In fact, actually, soon after Dr. Alzheimer's case report, he actually started using that diagnosis in his practice. It's actually fascinating to see. Dr. Alzheimer's began to then see patients and apply the label of his disease, as did other colleagues. And really, the case report was just a case report. It's a few years later, as they start applying the Alzheimer's concept in practice in Germany, that you begin to see how it plays out. And it's actually a few years later with another patient that Dr. Alzheimer's wrote up and diagnosed in his name, where you see the fights playing out that we still struggle with today. And that patient's name was Johann F. Johann F. also developed dementia, was slightly older than Auguste Dieter, but on Johann F.'s autopsy, which in his history sounded much like Auguste Dieter's, no evidence of syphilis, no evidence of vascular disease, two other common causes of dementia back then. He finds the sticky, unusual substance, the things we call plaques, but he doesn't find tangles. He didn't call them tangles. He doesn't find tangles. And he recounts other cases of Alzheimer's disease that are older. They're the senile age. And the point I'm trying to get at is that clearly, the psychiatrists of that time and the neuropathologists were struggling with the distinction between what we call senility and what we call Alzheimer's. They were struggling. They actually saw, we're seeing it in old people. It's not just a young person's disease. And yet, Alzheimer's disappeared. That debate that they had just flamed out by the 1930s. In her book, Forgotten, Narratives of Age-Related Dementia and Alzheimer's Disease in Canada, the literary scholar Marlene Goldman writes, contingencies and ironies abound when one probes the history of Alzheimer's disease. And so what are those contingencies and ironies that made Alzheimer's disappear for so many years? I'm going to tell you about 5 events that occurred. 5 events that I think, in addition or perhaps in spite of Emil Kraepelin's textbook, which made it a rare disease, all conspired to sustain that distinction. And the reason why I'm telling you these is because, not for sort of an afternoon, isn't history a funny thing and the lessons it teaches us, but isn't history an interesting thing for telling us the choices we make and the systems within which we make our decisions. And don't ever neglect that now when there are decisions to be made now about what's Alzheimer's and what are we going to do about it. We're not freed from our values now. Just like, as I'm going to show you, over the 20th century, values and other, if you will, non-scientific things determined what's Alzheimer's and what's not. Well, what's the first one? Well, Emil Kraepelin was expelled essentially from the field of psychiatry. Emil Kraepelin was a biological psychiatrist. He was convinced that you could explain brain diseases, and the distinction between neurology and psychiatry in the early 20th century was not what we have now. But he was convinced that brain diseases are caused by pathology. That's why he really liked Alzheimer's case, because there were identifiable things under the microscope that could explain this person's problem. He was a biological psychiatrist, to use a 20th century term. He would never have said that then. He wouldn't have known, what the heck are you talking about? But he was a pathologist and a psychiatrist, as was Dr. Alzheimer's. But of course, another psychiatrist in the early 20th century was proposing a different way to view brain diseases, and his name was Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud had a very different way to explain why someone has a brain disease, based on a model that we would call Freudianism, but it was a model based on a psychodynamic theory. And in that battle between Emil Kraepelin, these are biologically based diseases, versus Sigmund Freud, these are diseases based on a psychodynamic disordering, Freud would win. In fact, you could foreshadow this when Alois Alzheimer's presented his case report of August Dieter at the 37th Assembly of the Southwest German Psychiatrists in Tübingen, Germany on a Saturday afternoon. His presentation of August Dieter was a total flop. He presented it. There were absolutely no questions because they were all very excited for the subsequent case, which was a case that was reporting how sexual repression was the cause of a psychiatric illness. And what follows a vigorous discussion of that case. There's a second point, it's just only history would do this, was that Kraepelin, because of his enamoring of biological causes of disease, a view that many of us now would go, well, no wonder, well, of course, what's going on here? But the times were the times. He discovered genetics, and he would become very enamored of the value of genetics to explain illness and disease. Kraepelin was a German. This was the 30s. Politics in Germany took an ugly turn with respect to genetics and eugenics, and that all but sealed Kraepelin's expulsion from the canon of psychiatry, such that a psychiatrist who ruled the field, his textbook was a great textbook, would disappear. Okay, well, that's one reason, but you could call that's just insider baseball of psychiatry fighting over a theory of disease. There were other things at work. The patients were hidden from society. The patients with senility, with Alzheimer's disease, with dementia, call it what you want, were hidden from society. Remember where August Dieter went to get diagnosed? The asylum in Frankfurt. That's where she would then live until she died. That's where patients with dementia went after they were diagnosed. They either stayed in the privacy of their families, hidden in the home, talk more about that in a minute, why, or they went to an asylum and were similarly hidden from society in an asylum. There's an interesting side note to August Dieter's history. Her husband began to complain of the 5 mark a day cost of her care in the asylum in Frankfurt and wanted to, it was the middle class rate, by the way, Germans, and wanted to move her to the public asylum. Alois Alzheimer's, now in Munich, got word of this and immediately arranged for the proper funds to keep her in the Frankfurt asylum, because if she moved, he wouldn't get her brain. So those of you who are caregivers and understand the financial cost and burden of Alzheimer's, it started from the very beginning, but fortunately Alzheimer's had a bit of wealth from in its family and could help support his patients so he could get her brain. So the patients are hidden from society, they're in asylums. Secondly, the disease was hidden from medical care. Psychiatry and neurology had very different models by the 20th century for understanding what's a disease. I already told you about psychiatry's model. Neurology's model was lesion causes disease. What is the lesion? This will lead to the disease. So for example, I remember when I studied neurology as a medical student, the neurologist, I trained in Chicago, said, think of the brain stem like the John Hancock building. It's that big and and you should think of it as that large, with each of the little nuclei along it where you can produce a lesion. So it was find that lesion. That'll explain the patient's disease. So a diffuse disease like a dementia became very uninteresting to neurology compared to lesion-based diseases like a stroke, etc. Also, psychiatry was physically separating itself from medicine. Psychiatry was moving into psychiatry wings. When I trained, across all hospitals I trained at, you'd say, oh, we've got to go see the patient in psychiatry. It didn't mean going to a different wing. It meant going to a different building. So asylums, and even in the hospital setting, the patients are being separated from medicine, such that Alzheimer's probably in the 20th century was endemic. Granted, there weren't as many as there are now, but it was quite prevalent. But the doctors couldn't see it because the doctors who would probably start to see it, namely neurologists, they weren't going to the asylums, they weren't going to the psychiatry wings, and so the disease lay hidden from medicine. So the patients are hidden away, the patients are hidden away, they're hidden away from medical practice, and the disease was also hidden from medical research. Brain tissue is very hard to get. Persons are in asylums, so after diagnosis they've disappeared. No one's going to biopsy a brain of someone with dementia, brain biopsies being quite dangerous. And neuropathology was a rare field, and doing stains on brain tissue is very difficult, actually. And so even if you did a brain autopsy, oftentimes the pathologist couldn't see it because they weren't trained in neuropathology. And finally, society was really blinded to seeing the disease. The family was the natural unit of care, and an older adult who was sick and couldn't get out of the house because of memory problems, etc., that was women's work. That's what women did. They would take care of the patient, whether that was the wife, or in the case of it was the woman who was the elderly patient, the daughter or daughter-in-law would take care of it. And that wasn't until the 1950s that the CDC stopped listing old age and natural causes as a cause of death. So I've listed a bunch of factors that all together, and I can't say which is causal, which came first, which led. You just have to see it as a matrix that all conspired to keep this disease hidden. So why did we suddenly discover Alzheimer's disease? Well, we suddenly discovered Alzheimer's disease for suddenly and all at once things began to happen. Number one, Freudian theories of disease collapsed. They absolutely collapsed. They just began to retreat and retreat and retreat. The asylums closed, and they closed quickly. Rapidly, all at once, asylums closed. You can go visit some of them. They're still around. They're fascinating. And the patient records are still lying on the floors and whatnot. They literally got out, and the patients were sent out to their homes or in the community, and so they started to show up in the hospitals with these families saying, what am I going to do? Because the families had changed. The families had changed. They no longer were, it was expected that there would be plenty of family members at home. Families were smaller. And the role of women had changed as the default, of course they'll do it person. Women were out trying to get work, etc., or they had to work. And finally, a value rose up in society that all adults should enjoy a respect for being a self-determining person. All adults should have their capacity to decide who they are and what they want to do, that is to say, their autonomy respected. So the loss of autonomy because of aging, because of a memory problem, etc., it frankly began to be seen unacceptable as a loss of autonomy, similar to the same kind of unacceptable loss of autonomy that you would experience because of your race or your gender. It used to be the norm, for example, in some parts of this country, that because of your color, there were certain places you couldn't go, certain water fountains you couldn't drink from. It used to be the norm because of your gender that there were certain jobs you just couldn't have. We just don't have women in med school. I remember a colleague who now is older when she applied to med school. They just couldn't fathom the idea. What will you do when you get pregnant? Well, I'll have the baby. How times have changed, and don't you ever forget that. But there was a time when autonomy was not a value universally enjoyed by all. And so if it's not universally enjoyed, how can the loss of it from a disease be seen as a disease? So in some sense, you can see Alzheimer's as really a disease of our ethic, the ethic of autonomy. It's taking it away, and we don't want to lose that. But there was a time when not everyone had it, so how could you feel the loss? If you can never enjoy it, how can you feel losing it? And then finally, with all those things in place, industrialized nations, especially the United Kingdom, who some of the earliest work on Alzheimer's disease came out of the UK, modern work, because they realized we have a state-funded healthcare system, we have to take care of these people, and we got to figure this out. And some of the earliest work to try to understand what is senility, what's the disease, came out of the United Kingdom. So, fast forward now to the present. In 1976, a neurologist named Robert Katzman wrote an essay called Alzheimer's disease, a serious and life-threatening, called The Prevalence and Malignancy of Alzheimer's Disease, a Major Killer. And in about 1,000 words, what he said was, senility is Alzheimer's disease. There's no distinction between them. We need to call senility Alzheimer's, and we need to think of it as such. He made his argument purely out of biology, electron microscopy studies, etc. But again, all those forces that I've told you about allowed him to make this case and have everyone say in 1976, well, of course. But remember, in an alternative universe, older adults, even now, could still have senility, and Alzheimer's could be an uncommon disease if we kept families large, if we didn't value autonomy, if we kept asylums open, and if we still adhered to a Freudian theory of disease. We could still say there's senility and there's Alzheimer's, even now. Be a different world, but we could. So let me read you the last lines of Katzmann's essay. In focusing attention on the mortality associated with Alzheimer's disease, our goal is not to find a way to prolong the life of the severely demented, but to find a way to call attention to our belief that senile as well as pre-senile forms of Alzheimer's are a single disease, a disease whose etiology must be determined, whose course must be aborted, and ultimately a disease to be prevented. That was 1976. So fast forward to now, what's happened? Well, two big events. Number one, we pushed the limits of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease already. I told you you have to have a diagnosis of dementia to be labeled Alzheimer's. That's true. But you can also now have a diagnosis of MCI. You're not normal, but you're not demented. And through that, you can be labeled as having Alzheimer's disease. That came out of and was discovered at the Mayo Clinic. The second big event that occurred was to disrupt pathology. It was the discovery of the ability to image amyloid using a radiotracer, a PET radiotracer. It was Pittsburgh compound B was the first compound developed to do that, and it could show you amyloid in a brain of a living person with Alzheimer's. Bill Klunk says that when the first image of PIB was shown at the Alzheimer's meetings in Stockholm, he said it was like the moment when a ball is hit at a baseball game and everyone knows, oh my God, that's going to go out of the park. Because that's how the field felt when they saw we don't have to wait till the patient dies to see amyloid in their brains. We can see it in a living person. And that's what takes us, MCI and the PIB radiotracer, and all the values I've gone through, all the changes in society that I've gone through, to a study like the A4 study, which you heard about. Cognitively unimpaired, and I'm a site for A4. Many of them are working, running boards, etc. Very busy in retirement, traveling, taking care of grandkids. But they've come in, they get an amyloid scan, and based on that scan result, it's either elevated, and then they get a drug, and then they're followed for about 5 years, or it's not elevated. I want to tell you a bit about how people respond to getting that news. If they hear that the result is elevated, they say, well, that's what I expected. My memory's not been as good as it has been. My mother had Alzheimer's. I kind of expected that. All right, let's get to work. They'll tell you as well, though, how they're careful who they tell that result to. You don't know what it's like around here if people learn that you might have Alzheimer's. They treat you differently. Some of them will tell you that. They'll tell you that their kids will say, well, you know, I'll be there for you. One kid says, you know, you need to move closer to me, Mom, now because of that. One woman, for example, told us how she struggles, should I continue working or should I retire and enjoy my remaining time? But that's a struggle for me because if I get Alzheimer's, I need money and so I should work, but you see her dilemma. So that's what they're working through, more or less. Those who learn they have not elevated, one and only one word, relief is the word they use, relief. They talk about a change in their time horizon. They feel like they have more time. Sadly, they actually say, I was going to start exercising, I was going to start, but now I don't feel it. Yeah. And I think to myself, well, how foolish that could be, because death's like a thief in the night. It could come and take you. But they are the dawn of the future of the new world of Alzheimer's disease. And so let's talk a bit about that. They're a patient who's labeled not because a doctor said the complaints you gave me are explained by the disease called Alzheimer's. They're people who will be labeled because the test I did says that you have this problem and here's this drug that you need. And so that takes us back to the corporate suites and the inventors and owners of those technologies. they are having a say in what is this disease. The rhetoric, if you will, that will surround how we talk about the tests, talk about the drugs, will help shape the rhetoric of what we talk about when we talk about the disease. That's simply the way it will be. The names of the drugs, the way they're advertised, the way they're discussed, they will help shape the way we talk about this disease. Think, though, about those other diseases I talked about. Cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attack. Osteoporosis, fall, fracture. Hypertension, stroke, heart attack. Very straightforward events in the lives of an older adult. That is to say, there's no ambiguity about stroke, heart attack, fracture, death. They're 0-1 events. They happen or they don't happen. They're easily measured, they're easily understood. What's the stroke and heart attack, fracture and Alzheimer's? There isn't. It's a slow train of decline, a slow whittling away of capacity. In fact, if you said death was the endpoint, many of you would say, that seems awfully late. Because the thing that we don't like about this disease is loss of autonomy. And to say that death would be something we would prevent, even Katzman recognized that to wait for that is to allow a suffering of the very thing we don't want to lose. But there's no 0-1 autonomy, right? I've lost my autonomy, I have my autonomy, I had a fracture. It's not like that. This is the ground zero struggle that the field will face, which is defining, have we made a difference in the lives of our patient? Cognition could be that, but cognition is a very difficult thing to measure. If I asked everyone in this room to write down on a piece of paper what's cognition and what tests should we use to measure it, I'd get, for each person, a variety of very different answers compared to heart attack, etc. And this will be one of the struggles that we'll face. Probably what we'll be doing is better monitoring our daily lives. Because if you think about it, what you really want to do is stay independent, right? You want to stay out in the world, active, doing the things you care about. And so here I think will be the irony of the future of Alzheimer's disease. We dread this disease, we call it a disease because it robs our autonomy and our privacy. But one of the ironies that we'll face is that to know that we're living well on treatment, we're going to have to surrender some of our autonomy and our privacy. We're going to have to surrender it, as I do, for example, with my father. He doesn't have Alzheimer's, but he's getting older, and I've picked up some changes. So I have his neighbors watching him, and they drop me little text notes and whatnot. I monitor all of his bank accounts. I wish he was online, but he's not, because I'd monitor him that way. So I'm intruding into his privacy, calling him up and asking him non-directive questions to see how he's doing. I think we should expect in the workplace, with our cars, with our finances, a new world where what we do and how we do it is going to be watched over. And so we're going to need to think carefully about who does that, who has to say, how it's interpreted. This is a disease that right now is essentially a Gothic horror story. You come in with symptoms and signs. A doctor like me says, well, I think it's probably this. I do my best with some additional testing to say it is definitely this, and with amyloid imaging, I can get closer to that and tau imaging as well someday. But if you think about it, for much of the 20th century, it's been kind of a Gothic horror story. I can't really tell you exactly what's wrong with you until you die and I get your brain, but then you're dead. And even then, what I find out is, well, this is what's now, but I think it explains what happened 10 years ago, so there's sort of a cruel kind of like comedy to it as well. And that's been the story of Alzheimer's disease for the 20th century. And I believe that is one of the reasons why lurid metaphors surround this disease. Death before death, the walking dead, they're like zombies. That's the rhetoric that you can see out there. One of my hopes for the new world of Alzheimer's diagnosed by biomarkers, is that it will change that rhetoric. That it will remove the Gothic horror story that you can only know it until you die, and then you won't know it because you're dead. That it will change that rhetoric, and will say, well, now I can foretell your future. And so it turns it into kind of an elegy that you're now going to, how are you going to live the rest of your life now that you know this? And maybe we'll drop the Gothic horror metaphors and instead embrace how are we going to live together with a disease that we know could strike each of us in time, over time, depending on the results of these tests. So I have some hope that these drugs and these biomarkers will help us change the way we talk about what we talk about when we talk about Alzheimer's. But of course, I'll leave you with, science always leaves us, if you will, the open circles or the square circles or the open triangles. In the first study of Pittsburgh compound B that showed you could image amyloid, they scanned people who had Alzheimer's disease dementia, and they scanned people who were cognitively normal. And you would expect that the Alzheimer's disease dementia people would have amyloid, and the cognitively normal people would not have amyloid. And that was generally the case, except for there were a few what I call square circles and open triangles. So if you had Alzheimer's, you had a circle, and if you had if you didn't have Alzheimer's, you had a square. And they had some patients who had Alzheimer's disease dementia but didn't have amyloid, just one or two. And they had some patients who had one who had normal cognition but had amyloid. And they're kind of glossed over in the paper, but of course the rest is history, which is that if you do start scanning patients who you say have Alzheimer's disease dementia, you find a fair number don't have the marker you think that explains the disease. They're, if you will, undiagnosed, lost back in that kind of world of mystery. What's wrong with me? What explains my problem? And so while we may tidy up the problem of Alzheimer's, amyloid and tau, and alter the natural history as we do cancer, as we do heart disease, as we do osteoporosis, as we do diabetes, we will have our, if you will, open circles or open triangles, namely, or square circles, namely those who we don't yet know quite what's wrong with them, and yet something is wrong with them, but we don't know why. So we'll still have that, if you will, mystery to unfold. So our challenges await us. So I thank you for this opportunity to kind of overview sort of where we've been and where we may go. I would leave you with the point that I think someday, I think probably before I retire from the field, I don't think we'll use the term Alzheimer's disease. I think it's done a very good job in the 20th century to raise awareness and make us concerned, but I think the more we use our biomarkers and other tests, etc., the less the term really works for us anymore. I don't know what the new term will be, but I think we'll retire that term. Josh, that's it. Open for questions, I guess? Is that, yeah? Okay, great. So, thanks. Guys, it's the end of the day, and so, but if someone has a question, I'm happy to answer it. I'll be around until tomorrow, so yeah. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. So the person with the square or the triangle that didn't match, so is the implication that it's just it's a different disease?
It's something else. Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I remember I had a patient with well-characterized mild cognitive impairment, former executive, clearly was changed, couldn't run the business anymore, and I was going to enroll him in a clinical trial that you had to get an amyloid scan, and his amyloid scan was negative. And it was interesting, he was happy that it's not Alzheimer's. And his wife was devastated because she said, well, then what is this? Other questions? Yeah, it's right here.
Since the PET scan is fairly predictive of at least MCI onward to Alzheimer's, when do you think Medicare or health insurance will begin covering this very expensive test?
So the question is right now Medicare doesn't pay for amyloid PET scans for the diagnosis of cognitive impairment, which is what their FDA label is. And the reason why Medicare chose not to pay for them was because they could not find evidence of what the value would be. It's interesting, if you read the discussions at FDA's hearings on amyloid PET scans, they say, if you show me a radio image of a fractured leg, a broken bone is a broken bone, and it speaks for its value there, right? But if you show me an image of a PET scan with elevated amyloid, it's almost a question of, how do you cast a fractured brain? And the field's still struggling with that. What is the value of that test such that it's worth paying for? And I think there's one and only one answer to that, which is the drug, which is linking that test to then a drug you prescribe that changes the natural history of the disease. And that would be my prediction, that once there's that Mevacor for the brain, then that test gains its value. and the disease is renamed, and the money flows.
So maybe that's getting at my question, but your hypothesis that you don't think that the term Alzheimer's will be in existence as you leave the field and retire, what would be different from it from say cancer, where we've clearly learned that there are different types of cancer.
Right.
We don't treat all breast cancers the same, but we still call them cancer, right? It's uncontrolled cell proliferation. So, what's the distinction?
Yeah, so then the Lewy Body Society and the FTD Society would have to surrender, and they would all become the Alzheimer's societies, where it's understood that Alzheimer's just describes neurodegenerative diseases, and whether they're caused by TDP-43, ubiquitin, amyloid, tau, things yet to be discovered. That would have to be the language shift, that Alzheimer's will be like cancer, and it covers all neurodegenerative diseases. And it's really funny, because you can't say dementia, because dementia is a stage. Neurodegenerative disease just doesn't work well, and as Ron Peterson says, the society called the non-specific, protein aggregation society just doesn't work either, to roll off the tongue to motivate Congress to fund you. So and this is a very important branding issue the field's going to struggle with, I think.
So do you think it's like a natural history, and the stakes have been claimed, so to speak?
Say that again?
Do you think it's almost a natural history in how things have progressed in terms of stakes being claimed on the labeling?
Yeah, so the question is the history of the labeling of Alzheimer's. Is it a natural history? I wouldn't call it a natural history. I would call it a social and political history. So it is very much grounded in our values. It is not in science. It is branding. This is a branding issue. And I know branding sounds pejorative, but think about what a brand is. When you hear Coke, you just don't hear a label for a brownish, sugary, sweetened thing that tastes good on ice and with a little bit of rum. You hear happy afternoons, parties, good feeling, because Coke is it. And the brand Alzheimer's is a very powerful brand, but I believe it is unstable now, and it would be nice to keep it because it's very powerful, but maybe we'll come up with some other word.
One last question.
Two questions, really. First, if you have a layman who wants the PET scan, the amyloid PET scan, what will it cost, and where would he go to get one if he's not part of a study?
So the question is, how could a patient get an amyloid PET scan now, and outside of a research setting? And the answer would be, I suppose, on the East Coast, we've heard in New York and other places, we always look at New York as the, you guys are Marriott, Mount Sinai in New York, you can pad a pocket for it. How much it costs is, I guess, how much they want to charge, right? I don't know the answer to how much it would cost out of pocket, but that would be what you would have to do. At our center, though, we get them through research often, and for a while, CMS. So let me. For a while, CMS sponsored a study called the IDEAS study, which stands for something. Don't ask me, Josh, if you know. And IDEAS was testing the value of amyloid PET scanning in patients with MCI or dementia. And so let's give Medicare credit where credit is due. Namely, they said there isn't evidence to support the value of this, but let's get the evidence. And so they have a study. It's finished. The data are being analyzed, called IDEAS, where thousands of adults in Medicare got an amyloid scan, and data were gathered about the subsequent impact of that scan result on clinical care. And we're for individuals with either MCI or dementia. And we will look at those data, and we will decide, does having that scan make a difference in the lives of those patients such that it's worth something for them? And that study will help maybe change Medicare's decision about funding those scans, paying for those scans. So that's what's happening.
I think we will thank them.